Welcome everyone. My name is Amy Woods. I'm a graduate of the class of 1997 and the Executive Director of Alumni Relations at Marist. We're excited to present to you tonight this webinar with three prominent faculty from our School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. As a quick side note, 9 of our faculty from that school have recently shared short videos for those who have suddenly found themselves with homeschool responsibilities. So these fun and informational videos can be accessed from our virtual opportunities page through the Marist alumni website. We shared one of them so far yesterday on Facebook. We plan to roll them out slowly, but they're all available on one page on our website. And towards the end of this webinar, we can share a link to that page in the chat box on your screen. And speaking of the chat box, a few additional notes before we begin. If you encounter any audio issues, you do have the option to dial in and listen via telephone. So I provided that number, the phone number and the access code in the chat box. We're going to reserve the chat box for technical questions that you might have for the alumni staff who are on the call tonight. And we're going to reserve the Q&A feature for actual questions that you might have for our panelists. And we just ask that when you do submit a question, if you could direct it to the specific faculty member that you would like to ask, that would be helpful. There will be a brief survey. The WebEx system allows us to do this, which is nice. Since we've had to move everything online, we want to know what we can do better, what we can do more of. So there'll be a brief survey on your screen. It should pop up as soon as this is over, only 5 questions. If you can take a minute to submit that, we would really appreciate it. But I would like to first tell you about our panelists before we begin. Dr. Carol Rinke joined Marist faculty in 2013, where she serves as Associate Professor of Education and Assistant Dean for the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. She teaches courses in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, otherwise known as STEM. Carol maintains an active research agenda and is the author and editor of more than 20 articles and 3 books on teacher career development over the professional lifespan. She is also the mother of 2 boys, ages 11 and 14, and is currently homeschooling. Assistant Professor of Special Education, Dr. John Wright, is an instructor and researcher with a focus on special education and the preparation of future teachers. His recent work involves teaching academic skills to children with autism, intellectual disability, and complex communication needs. He taught for 12 years at both the primary and secondary levels and spent 3 years as an elementary school administrator in a large urban school district. Dr. Mary Kelly specializes in applying an equity-oriented lens to the study the intersection of teacher education and literacy. Her research centers on preparing teachers to conceive of practice through an anti-oppressive pedagogy. Mary's research interests began during her career as an urban, suburban, and international secondary English teacher. As an assistant professor of education at Marist, she works with her teacher candidates at Marist to incorporate literacy practices into project-based learning classrooms. And I might add, as of today, we all learned that the Student Government Association at Marist has awarded her Faculty Member of the Year for the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, so congratulations, Mary. But all 3 of you, Carol, John, and Mary, thank you very much for taking time out of your schedules to spend with us this evening. We can't wait to see what you're going to show us.
All right, so thank you so much, Amy. And really welcome to all of the participants. We were so excited to see so many Marist alumni sign up for the webinar, from across campus, and we were especially excited to see so many of the graduates from our education program who are joining us. So a special hello to all of the graduates from the education program and to everybody. We really noticed in terms of who is joining us this evening that we have a lot of folks that are parents, and we have a lot of folks that are educators. So we're going to try, in what we talk about today, to really try to address the needs of both, try to address the needs of parents and educators. So let's go ahead and get started. All All right, so just a little bit of an introduction. This is me. On the left, I have the photograph of the STEM fair that we did last fall. This was our most recent STEM fair. We were actually supposed to have our STEM fair for this semester. We were supposed to have it this week, but we kind of had obviously a little bit of a change in plans. So I teach the STEM courses here at Marist, Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, as Amy introduced earlier, based on my time in the classroom. And then I spent the last 13 years doing teacher education in the STEM field. And one of the kind of big things that I do as part of this STEM course is offer a STEM fair in the evening at a local elementary school. And one of the things that I think is particular about this event that kind of informs what we're going to talk about this evening is the fact that this STEM fair is in the evening, and it's an attempt to kind of bring students and families together around science and engineering. So it's not just something that happens in the school, but it's really kind of a collaboration between the schools and families. And I think that's something we'll see as we talk about this a little bit more this evening. On the right is a picture of my family. So there I am with my husband, Michael, and my two boys, Kobe, who's 14, he's in 9th grade, first year of high school, and Noah, who is 11, he's in 6th grade, his first year of middle school. For those of you that took the STEM class, they might have looked a little bit younger to you in the videos, but this is what they look like now. And so I'm also, as a parent, trying to juggle, working from home and also kind of supporting my children while they're in this virtual learning environment as well. So I am currently wearing both hats. And what I wanted to share with you to kind of start us off today is a little story that happened right as this whole, kind of coronavirus pandemic was kind of, starting, and all of the schooling environment was switching to online right as everything was kind of happening in a crisis moment. My kids, the very first week, my kids had just started moving online, and I get a call from a friend of mine who also has a son who is in the 6th grade, and she basically just wants to tell me how terrible online learning is and how all they're doing are packets, right? She's like, here we are, and they're online, and they're just doing packets. And it was kind of this aha moment for me, because I realized that this is, a good friend of mine who works in healthcare, didn't actually have any understanding from her perspective of what a packet would be, right? It might be something really boring, or it might be a really vital part of the learning process. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you today. And I'm calling it cross-cultural communication. It's not really cross-cultural communication, but I want us to think a little bit about how teachers are thinking in this online learning environment, so that parents can kind of understand maybe what's going on in teachers' minds. And then on the other hand, I also want teachers to understand what parents are experiencing. So I really want us to try to kind of think about how the other is coming to this new online learning experience. And also, some of the positives that can come out of it. I already mentioned that, the STEM fair really centers on this kind of school-family connection and making some of those school and home connections. And I know for the teachers out there, this is something that we are always aspiring to. We're always trying to make these tighter connections between home and school. And now all of a sudden, we are kind of thrust into this situation where we are making those home-school connections, whether we like it or not. So I think one positive that really could come out of it is the fact that we have this unique opportunity to make these connections in ways we never have before. Okay, so this is where I started thinking about kind of what does this cross-cultural communication mean? What does this online learning mean for us? And I started by Googling teacher. And this is the first picture that came up. And I think that if we think about it, this is kind of our cultural image of a teacher. There she is. She's at the center of the classroom. She's writing something on the board. I particularly like that she was writing pi. And she is at the center of the classroom, kind of sharing her knowledge with the class. This is when we think about a teacher, this is what we think about. But I think we all know, those of us in education and those of us who think about teaching know that actually this is more what a classroom should be like. So the teacher shouldn't necessarily be at the center. The students should be at the center. And the teacher is actually off to the side kind of providing support. But it's the students, it's their ideas, and it's their learning that's at the center. And also that they should be working together to kind of learn new things rather than just taking them in from the teacher. And this idea that we teach in our education classes is absolutely supported by research. So the National Research Council's summary report showed that students learn best in a situation that is, they call it learner-centered, knowledge-centered, and assessment-centered, which means that students' ideas are, at the heart of the learning. The teacher kind of adds knowledge to that, and then the teacher also provides assessment or gives feedback, right, to the students' learning. So the students' learning is really at the heart of what's happening, and it also happens to whatever extent possible within a community. And of course, the official term for this is constructivism. Many of you know this, but it's this idea that, again, learning doesn't come just from listening to a teacher, it comes from the student kind of constructing new knowledge. Another way that a lot of folks have thought about this recently is this idea of a flipped classroom. It's this idea, if you've heard of the flipped classroom, it's this idea that rather than students going to class and hearing a lecture or hearing a video, they have the flipped classroom. They watch the video at home the night before, and then they go to class to kind of talk about the video or make meaning from the video. So all of this kind of leads to this idea of what I'm calling a learning cycle, or what some folks have called a learning cycle, right? It's this idea that when students learn things, they have some new experience. They try to then make meaning from that experience, often with input from a teacher, and then they kind of try out that new meaning. They try out what they've learned. So this is kind of at the heart of learning. And one of the things that I have observed in this whole new environment is that this is not at all inconsistent with our online learning environment, right? It's actually quite similar to what a lot of folks are doing in an online learning environment. It doesn't look exactly like it does in the classroom, right? The methods that we're using have been totally turned on their heads, but this learning cycle is still in place, where kids are experiencing something new, they're getting feedback from the teacher, and then they're kind of trying out an opportunity. They're kind of taking that idea and trying it in a new way. So I really do see online learning as absolutely consistent from the learning cycle. And if I was going to go back to my friend, I would say to her, maybe it's not a packet, maybe it's just one step in the learning cycle. So I think the key is that we want our students not necessarily to replicate exactly what happens in the classroom, but we want them to get the chance to learn or experience something new in one form or another, to get some feedback from the teacher in one form or another. It could be email, it could be a Zoom, it could be written assessment, and to connect with students in some way or another. So as long as they're getting these elements, it doesn't matter if it's in a kind of a formal classroom environment or an online learning environment. The next thing that I wanted to point out is that even though we're all of a sudden living in this kind of highly new technological world, it's not actually about the technology. It's not kind of the fancy technology that the teacher is using that matters. It's actually the thinking that matters. And that's why I put Bloom's taxonomy on here as well. I think we're all familiar with Bloom's taxonomy and kind of these increasingly sophisticated levels of thinking. But this, I think, is another way to think about it, is that when we're looking at what our kids are experiencing, it's not about whether they're engaging with the fanciest technology. It's whether they are kind of engaging in these higher levels of thinking. So I think, again, as a parent, we can look and see what our kids are doing and say, not necessarily how, maybe it's just email, maybe it's just the lowest level of technology, but are they creating, analyzing, are they getting the chance to kind of apply these ideas in new ways? So just to kind of wrap this up, I think that, what does all of this mean for parents? I think as a parent, what this means, and this is kind of how I have approached it, is that we can give ourselves permission to let that learning cycle unfold, that we don't need to be on top of every step of the way. We don't need to be kind of checking every, our students' answer to every single homework question, but we can kind of generally assure that our kids are ready for learning, that they get a good night's sleep, that they're, have a quiet place to learn, but that they can kind of on their own manage that learning cycle. And it's not necessarily our job to walk them through it, but just to kind of put them in a place where they can engage with that learning cycle. And for teachers, I think, we're seeing, like I said before, that we have an opportunity to engage with parents in ways that we, have always wanted to, and now all of a sudden have the chance to. So for parents, my one recommendation would be to communicate with children, but to communicate with, or that teachers should communicate with parents as well, and not just at the level of, this is what your students have to do, but also this is why they're doing that, because this is a chance to kind of educate children, but it's also a chance to educate parents so they kind of understand that learning cycle as well. So I'll just end with kind of a plug for increased communication between parents and students, and to kind of continue to build those bridges that we've been, wanting to build for years, and we now have a unique, although maybe unexpected, opportunity to do so. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, John Wright, who's going to talk a little bit about creating structure during this time.
Thank you, Carol. So I wanted to, before I start, you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's a Q&A box. If you have some questions about what Dr. Rinke or what I say or Dr. Kelly says, as we go through, you can type in questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to see those. And when we're done sort of giving you a basic background, we can respond to some of those. So keep that in mind as we move forward. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm calling creating structure, but really I'm talking about social and emotional wellness for you and for your students. So I'm going to give you some ideas about sort of what I call teaching 101, what I teach my students when we talk about principles of instruction, specifically for kids who might have learning differences, but as we know in the education world, when you are explicit in your instruction, that's good for everyone. So this is a quick tip for parents to help with your homeschooling. So Dr. Rinke will forward the slides for me. So my first point is this is new for everyone. And if you haven't heard this, you're doing a great job if you're a parent teaching your kids at home. And if you are a teacher and you're new to what you are doing virtually, you're doing a great job as well. So you have to give yourself a little bit of grace to understand that we're all stressed in different ways and we're all learning to learn in different ways. So give yourself a break as you think about how you are teaching and learning, both as an adult, either a parent or teacher. So yeah, give yourself a pat on the back. So I came up with 4 sort of very basic ways to structure what you're going to do. And some of this is academic and some of this is social and emotional. So the first one is, oh, great timing. So if you haven't done this, I highly recommend creating a routine. When your child is old enough, you can create the routine with them, but your day is not going to be able to emulate what a school day would be like. School days have lots of transitions. They are not learning 7 or 8 hours during the day. There's lots of space in between the learning opportunities. So don't have it in your mind that your child, regardless of the grade level, is going to be doing academic stuff for a large chunk of the day. It's just not going to happen. And that's not really what happens in the school day anyway. But when you set up a routine, you can see on this slide, a visual is always really good, regardless of the age of the student or if they have some specific learning needs. It's good because it's something that you can reference and that as things change, you can update it. So it doesn't have to be as detailed as this one that I have here, but this is sort of an example that I found online through this kind of crisis that seems to be an appropriate way to approach this, which is making sure they're getting up and not sleeping until 3 in the afternoon and then starting schoolwork, but also incorporating both academic time, time for their brain to rest, refuel with lunch, do some responsible things at home, and kind of structure their day as if it were more than just being at home. Obviously, this will look different for younger students as it will for older students, and older kids will be able to participate in articulating what their schedule should be. But if you make this important, it will do a lot to make it seem important to your student. So create a structure. Next thing that I want to talk to you about is the one teaching tool that I will say is probably invaluable right now is what we call a task analysis. And really it's just a step-by-step way of doing something. We take it for granted as adults sometimes that we use these and we can mentally click off when we do a certain step and move to the next step. But we're finding, like the one on the right here, you know, steps to washing your hands have become really important right now during this pandemic. This is an example of a task analysis for a behavior that would be really important for a student to be able to follow. So task analyses are really good for being explicit for what you want a student to do, but also it gives them visuals and really, I call it terse and pithy, short amount of information and full of information. So these are bullet points that are really full of information. So a task analysis also is common in academic tasks. If you're familiar with Khan Academy, which I think a lot of people are right now, some kids are being funneled into some of Khan Academy's activities. When you teach just about anything, but specifically things like math or science that have a process or procedure, you use a step-by-step approach to this. When there are visuals, it helps. And when you can see it demonstrated through a video, for example, that also helps because videos can be referenced and re-referenced to help students remember the process. So whenever you can actually film a task analysis for a chore or for solving a math problem or for something around the house on an iPhone. And it's pretty simple to do, and it can be stored so that they can watch it or rewatch it. You also don't have to recreate the wheel because task analyses are really well known in the teaching world. And I bet you can find one online for just about any academic or behavior task that you want your child to engage in. So you probably don't even have to create it yourself. You can beg, borrow, and steal things from the internet. Next. So the third thing I want to talk to you about is screen time. And screen time is not, all screen time is not created equal. And screen time is going to be an issue, but you also need to understand that we are asking students to do virtual schooling. Their screen time is probably going to increase. You're going to have to allow for more screen time than you normally would. But there are a couple of things that educators through the New York Times that worked with Johns Hopkins University and through the George Lucas Educational Foundation said that when you're thinking about screen time, there are 4 things that you really need to also plan that can be part of a task analysis, but are important for balancing life in this new virtual world. The first of which is screen time right before bed is really hard. It's harder for kids to go to sleep. You can read lots of studies about the different light and the blue light versus white light and how that affects brain functioning late at night. So there needs to be typically between 30 minutes and an hour break between the last screen time and when a child goes to sleep. Plan offline activities, hopefully with the whole family or at least with an adult in the household, and that can be part of your task analysis because that gives a reason for not being online during the day. Prioritizing schoolwork, video chats, and educational games over other kinds of screen time that are more leisure time related are going to be important. So make sure that when there is the option to watch an online video or an option to play an educational game, clearly you would want your students to be engaging in that more than watching YouTube videos or playing Minecraft. And the last thing, which is going to be the hardest thing, which is kids need to embrace being bored, which means you don't have to be stimulated through technology all the time. So good old-fashioned board games or paper and pencil tasks are okay to do. So we're talking about packets and things like that. I tend to think that packets, paper and pencil packets, will be a vital part of the homeschool and virtual school experience, because it is something that is going to be different than the interactive and perhaps technologically overwhelming world that our kids are going to be in for a while. So don't shy away from packets right now. And the last thing, and this is more for parents and for teachers, but challenge behavior happens when we're all together on top of each other, especially when we're in the house for long periods of time. And there are things that we can do as the adults to make sure that we stay connected. The reason why this is important is if this cycle that I call connection cycle stays together, it's easier to get you and your child back on task. I'm not going to read all these things to you, but I think it's important that you understand that you're not expected to be perfect in this, and neither are they. So when you are upset or they are upset, these are things that you can do or you can teach them to do in order to take a break, understand this is hard, but still do the things we need them to do to be educated. And finally, in preparing for this, I saw that a lot of people were interested in some special education resources, both for their own children or their teachers of kids with special education needs. And there's a lot going on right now that is very useful. The Council for Exceptional Children has made all of their online tools free through the end of May. There's a link right there, or you can just search Council for Exceptional Children, and it's on their homepage. You register, but you don't pay anything. It has lesson plans, there are videos, there are modules to work through, there are even activities to do with your kids. So when you're looking for something that has been specifically designed for children or needs, it's sort of gold standard. And right now, all of these are free, so I recommend that highly. Some Weeks also has a set of videos and online training for parents that are free. The link is also here. And these are a really quick guide for parents on if you have questions or if you don't know what to do, they have a plethora of resources for you. And finally, one that I use with my students all the time is through Vanderbilt University. It's called the Iris Center, and they have a resource locator. So if you're looking for paper and pencil tasks, if you're looking for a case study, or if you're looking for videos for yourself, for grown-ups, or for children, there's probably a resource here for you. There are plenty of videos to teach you how to do certain kinds of things, like how to prompt your student to be more independent on a math task. There's a video for that. So these three resources are really valuable for kids with special education needs, and hopefully you can take advantage of these, especially now because they are free and people are developing new videos every day. And I'm not sure if that's my last slide. Is that my last slide, Dr. Rinke? Okay, so I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Kelly. And again, if you have questions throughout this, type the questions into the Q&A and we'll address them at the end.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wright. I am going to be talking today a little bit about literacy and how literacy is part of every single waking moment that we are existing today. So what I want to start talking about first is this idea that we're actually, just like what Dr. Rinke said, is like we're actually in a really wonderful time for innovation. And so remote learning right now has provided a unique opportunity for us to think about literacy in an expansive way and in a new way to consider what it means for children and youth to be literate. Children in your home right now might have packets. They might be reading a book. They might be doing a reading program assigned by their teachers. But there's other ways to ensure that your child is actually developing a nuanced way of being literate outside of these tools that the teacher has given the child. So, for example, literacy is not just reading and writing. Literacy is informational literacy, technological literacy, visual literacy, critical reasoning, statistical literacy, and data literacy, meaning that everything that children are doing right now, whether it's engaging online with a video, whether it's talking to you about what's going on with the pandemic, whether it's looking at images or graphs about what's going on with the pandemic, whether it's reasoning on how to adapt to the everyday world right now, or whether it's just gathering information about these new ways to engage in remote learning, children and youth today are developing complex and nuanced ways to be literate. So literacy in the everyday, so here's an example of what students could be doing right now, or children or youth could be doing right now. So if children are navigating their social, emotional responses to what's going on, you might find that children and teenagers are wanting to go outside a lot more than maybe they did previously. And so engaging in nature in any way, shape, or form is a form of natural literacy. Engaging with conversations with their peers, figuring out ways to read their teachers online and instructions online, and basically everything that you can possibly imagine, playing games, watching Netflix, all of these things are ways that children are taking information in and actually making sense and meaning of a very complex and difficult time. And so what's unique about the remote learning experience is that children are working often, unless there's multiple children in the home, often working in seemingly isolation. But what's unique about the remote learning environment is actually children are more connected than they've ever been. So they're playing games with other students in their classroom, educational games, sometimes assigned by teachers, and sometimes games that they found themselves. They're chatting while they're Zooming. They are sometimes engaging in collaborative writing, engaging in collaborative reading. And so there is this sort of network of remote learning that's happening that a way to think about it is that we are learning a new language. And so children are learning the language of remote learning. And that in and of itself is innovative and interesting. And we're tired. And so it's really important to recognize that we've all talked about it. Being on screen all day long can be exhausting. Finding ways to learn a new language. I don't know how many of you speak multiple languages, but learning a new language is exhausting. It's exhausting to figure out how to communicate. It's exhausting to figure out how to make yourself understood, to even understand. And so thinking about this remote learning experience as a language has really been helpful for me to think of expansive ways to engage with children and youth around literacy that might be outside of sort of predictable things that are happening in the classroom. I think you changed the slide, but I don't see it. Yeah, there we go. So what can we do at home? You might be asking yourself, wow, Dr. Kelly, it's all good that you have this expansive view of literacy, that every day I'm learning information in a new language, but what can we actually do at home? Well, I have several suggestions. So the first suggestion I have is podcasts. So there's two ways to consider podcasts. There are 1,000 podcasts in the world. And not only that, but most of them are free. And they provide so many types of literacies that it's unmanageable. So think about this. There's scientific podcasts, there's story podcasts, there's mysteries podcasts. And so this notion of simply listening to podcasts is really, really powerful because children can actually listen at a higher syntax level. They can listen to complicated language higher than what they can read. And so listening to podcasts is really, really useful to learn information, and you don't have to be looking at a screen. Also, there's been a lot of research in this idea that reading along with a podcast, so most podcasts actually come with transcripts. And so you can actually print transcripts out, and you can help kids read along with a podcast, and that builds confidence in reading, and they're still engaging deeply in the ideas. And it really helps kids stay focused on the reading. And like I said, they're accessible, they're free, And you're going to be able to give children and youth contemporary podcasts about what's going on right now, and they're going to be able to engage in ways that are actually very similar to adult literacy. The next is audiobooks, similar to podcasts, but that since students can listen at a higher language level, the idea is you might want to expose them to books that you might want to have a book club, right? So maybe you've just been waiting for years to read Harry Potter. I have to admit, I never read Harry Potter. And it's a deep shame as being a literacy person that I've never read it. I'm just a little too old during the time. So say you're like, finally, I'm going to read Harry Potter, but you're also tired. You're also engaging. Your eyes have been looking at the computer screen all day. You can do audio book clubs at home where everyone listens to stories and talks about those stories. And it's a wonderful way to engage in all kinds of fiction and nonfiction and young adult lit books in a way that's engaging for the whole family. Similar, if you are like, you know what, I love the podcast idea, I love the audiobook idea, but I really want my child to read, or maybe they actually have to read a whole book or short stories for the class, maybe that's been assigned to them. You can consider finding film adaptions. And so there's many film adaptions to canonical or like classic texts that we ask children to read. And so finding a movie adaptation to support reading is also really important, mostly because reading for pleasure is one of the most important drivers in children's cognitive development. And so getting them engaged with wanting to read the book is also an easy thing that you can do at home to supplement their engagement. Another thing that we can do that sort of addresses this notion of expansive literacy is you can engage in inquiry activities outside of the computer. So creating scavenger hunts, science experiments, even cooking and teaching children to cook different food experiments builds literacy on multiple levels. I recently have a girlfriend whose children created a rock scavenger hunt for the other children in the neighborhood. So they hid rocks that painted different colors, and they dropped the clues on their doorstep. And so children at different times were going around the neighborhood and trying to find the different rocks. And so it's doing any sort of inquiry activity where you ask a question and have children be interested in different ways of how to access it and answer that question is developing literacy. Going outside and finding activities is developing literacy. And so scientific literacy, it could be linguistic literacy, all of these different things. Okay, so this is the one suggestion I have that involves the computer. But say you just really wanted to go to a museum and it's closed right now, and you've been, really wanting to see pandas in the zoo, which is one of my life goals. And maybe when I go see theater performances, then there are many free opportunities to do virtual tours of museums, zoos, and theater performances, and you can do that right from home. So engaging children in real-world literacy in that way is also a really fun and engaging thing to do outside of the classroom. Finally, there is literacy games. So games that are, and Dr. Wright mentioned this, games like Scrabble, games like any board games, charades. I love charades, and charades develops vocabulary tremendously. And so it's such a fun game that everyone can play, but you're still developing vocabulary with your children and yourself. And so thinking of different literacy games that you actually can play at home, you might consider that a way to engage, but also something that's completely separate to their academic demands. And so if you're interested about where you can get these resources, you can access that QR code or scan it. And if you have an Android that's like old because you haven't updated your phone like me, you might not be able to scan that. So you can use that link there, and it's just a list of resources. And most of my resources are resources that you could find online. A lot of them are from Edutopia, and they are just resources for audio books, for games, for virtual tours, for inquiry activities that you can do at home. And so there's lists of activities that you can do outside of the classroom.
So I think now, if you have questions or things that we haven't answered and you want us to chime in with some of our opinions, you can type that in the Q&A box. There are a few that came prior to this. When you signed up, you had some opportunities to leave some questions or some areas that you wanted us to talk about. So I'm going to start with one question, then I'll pose this to either Carol or Mary, which is, how many hours a day do you think virtual school should happen? And I guess I'll toss that to Carol first.
Thanks, John. I mean, I think you actually talked a little bit about this also, that there's, in a typical school day, there's so much transition that happens, and there's so much that actually isn't strict academic work, that I actually think our students in this environment are getting, in some ways, a more concentrated academic experience, because when they focus in, they're focusing in without without these kind of transitions between classes, without assemblies, without kind of all of the special things that happen during the school day. So I don't know that I have a specific hour or a specific number, but I would say that students need breaks, and that it shouldn't go on, for 6 or 8 hours uninterrupted. That if they have 30 or 45 minutes of solid academic work, that's really very productive work. And then a break, and then another, block or two of that work. I mean, I think many of us have heard the general rule of thumb that kids can concentrate for about the number of minutes as their age. So for young kids, those short blocks of time really are productive time. And then as they move into the teenage years, and even for us adults, we can focus for a little bit longer. But I don't think we should be expecting, 6 or 8 hours of uninterrupted work. That doesn't mean that we can't work for that amount of time, and they can, as John also said earlier, kind of entertain themselves independently through all of the literacy activities and other exercises. But I think that solid academic work should be, in briefer chunks and, broken up. Mary, do you want to add to that?
I was going to say the exact same thing. I think we are expecting students to, I don't know if everyone here agrees, but I know I'm working more because I don't have transitions or people stopping to my office or like things like that. So I feel like I've actually increased the amount of work. And so I think that since we're doing that to children, I think it's important to recognize that 8 hours is just way too much. And so I think if you are worried about how much time students are actually, or children or youth are actually engaged online, I think a good way to think about it is to supplement time that they're staring at the screen with fun activities and things that they can do that are still educative, but that aren't necessarily directly on the computer.
Thank you for that. And there's a little bit of a shout out for podcasts in the Q&A. Someone's saying that they've used them with 4th grade students, some podcasts called 6 Minutes. That's a good writing, to spark writing ideas. So you've inspired someone to share that, Mary. And I think I would piggyback on that and say, obviously, developmentally, as far as the amount of time, young students probably are not going to be able to do a sum total of more than maybe 1 or 2 hours of academic work spread out across the day, whereas older kids obviously can add on to that. You'd be surprised. A 1st grader, 2 hours of academic activity throughout the whole day seems reasonable and maybe too much some days. So I don't think you can put a number on it. I think you're going to know your kiddo better than we do, but don't feel the pressure to do a 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. schedule. Next question is, what if you can't possibly do everything that the teacher sends for your student to do? Or conversely, what if this teacher doesn't send enough? I'll jump in on that one and just say, I'm a big fan of over-communicating with teachers. So I think there's a communication that you as and I'm assuming this came from a parent, I think there needs to be an email or a conversation or a phone call about the expectations for the class. I know that most educators and most school districts are applying a kind eye to both the amount and maybe even the quality of stuff that is coming across virtually. So I don't think anyone is going to be offended if you talk to them directly about this not being enough for my student, or not challenging enough, or this is way too much. There's no way I can have my job or do my work at home or my domestic life or my family life and all of this stuff with my child or children. So have that conversation right now. Like, don't wait. Have it tomorrow if that is something that's concerning you. I'll throw that to my colleagues as well.
I'll just jump in and second the point about communication. I mean, I think that we are all, none of us who are alive have ever experienced anything like this. We are all in uncharted territory. And I think that, this is true for parents and it's true for teachers. Teachers are all of a sudden trying to figure out how to transition what they're used to doing into a new format. And they may have absolutely no idea that it's too much work or too little work. And so I think that, I know from, just our own experience transitioning our Marist courses online, that it's uncharted waters and, we're trying new things, but we're not quite sure yet how they're all going to turn out. And so we're hopeful, but any kind of feedback from is useful. So I think, just to communicate that is key, so that we can all kind of figure this out together.
Sorry, I'm trying to read some of the ones coming in. One question, I'll give this one to Mary, and your experience or your opinion, when should the school day start for young students versus old students, and when should it end?
I also think that is subject to your kiddo, because my initial reaction is I don't think teenagers do well when you force them to get up at 6 a.m. and to engage online. And so my initial statement is like, I actually think most kids learn better a little bit later. And so like 9, but I don't think there's a specific time. I think whether or not your kiddo likes to sleep in, whether they are awake really early. I think it's less about this like exact schedule and more about making sure that you find time to give breaks, that you actually create an agenda, a routine or a procedure. School is very routinized. Like, it's like kids are used to like, you're going this, you're going this, you're going this. So I think it's less about from this moment to this moment and more about making sure that no matter what you decide or what's possible with what's going on in your life right now, make sure that there's a routine to it.
I'll just add also, I absolutely agree with the point that it's kind of a student by student or a kid by kid situation. But an interesting thing along this theme of we're seeing some unexpected benefits from this experience of the pandemic is that there is a movement right now to kind of change start times for schools to kind of, coordinate more closely with children's biological, systems so that younger students, elementary age students, start the day earlier and adolescents start the day later, that's kind of more in line with their natural sleep cycles. And so this is, that movement hasn't gained as much traction as some people would like, but this is maybe an opportunity to innovate, in your own house and, let your older students sleep a little bit because adolescents do have a shifted sleep cycle, and let your younger kids, get up earlier and get going earlier also, in a way that maybe works for them instead of in a way that is prescribed by the school.
So the next question, I think we have time for at least one more, if I'm looking at the clock right. This one is a teacher question. It says, what are some ways to check in with students' emotions that you're familiar with? This teacher said that they tried to do a survey tool like a SurveyMonkey, but wasn't happy with that methodology. So I think this is checking in with the barometer of the students. Mary or Carol, do you want to jump in on that and then I'll weigh in?
Something I've done for older students is to do, just like I was talking about in terms of a routine, is doing check-ins that are different. So asking like, if you were a superhero character today, which one would you be? If you were, tell me if you were a weather pattern today, which one would you be? And giving them different opportunities to be vulnerable without necessarily oversharing. I mean, sometimes asking how are you feeling is too overwhelming, right? And so giving like this is with adolescents, like giving like a way that they can explain it that's fun or silly. I've also used Kahoot to have kids make their own Kahoots about themselves, and that's a way to just check in and have each other take their Kahoots about like what's going on in their life right now. And so there's different ways, but I think that the check-in, it's useful for it to be lighthearted with the potential to go more serious.
So just along those same lines, I mean, I also agree with the point that sometimes when it's too hard for kids to either articulate or experience their emotions, especially right now when we're all living in these uncertain times and we're having lots of emotions. And so one of the strategies that I try to use is to have like a external situation that they can talk about. Like maybe there's a case study about some hypothetical kid, and they can reflect on that case study or that example, and they can say things like, I'm having a similar experience or I'm having a different experience, but it's about this other, other kid or this video or something external to us, but then they can connect to it, and that might feel a little bit safer than talking about themselves directly.
And I was thinking of one just face-to-face way to check in. One of the tools that I think Mary was the one who told me about was there's a tool called Whereby, which is just a free tool that you can use to check in with your students in small numbers. The free tool only allows up to 3 students at a time, but it's almost like having office hours. This is your planning period where students could come by and just hang out or talk to you. And you could probably create a structure to where, your office hours or your planning period is a time where they can pop into your virtual classroom and just talk to you one-on-one or in a small group of up to 2 or 3 students, and just kind of have a sense of normalcy or a rapport building and, ask those questions about how they're doing. And it doesn't have to be in front of a whole Zoom class. And it's not quite as impersonal as a phone call. So I think that's one thing I would do. I think the last question that we have time for is, if you have students that are not completing daily academic assignments, do you think it's okay to block non-academic sites from their devices during regular school hours? I'll start by saying I live in a world where I have one foot in constructivist that we talked about, like kids form their own meaning through experiences and their background knowledge and grappling with content, and also one foot in behaviorism, where I understand that students, children, adults, we're all part of a system of reinforcement. So we go to work because there's a paycheck. We do leisure activities because it's fun. Students are also going to do things because there is, sometimes the reward is a great grade. Other times the reward is I get my parents off my back if I do it. So I think you have to use reinforcement and consequences very carefully right now in this weird world, because A, you're trapped with these little humans in your house, so you don't want to set weird precedences. But second of all, I believe that the balance between academic work and non-academic work has to be pretty structured right now, so that they know when they can do work and when they can do leisure. That seems really important to me. As far as blocking it, I think I am someone who does put some parental controls on devices, both time controls and otherwise. So I think that's important for you to manage when that's important to you as a family. I wish I had a more concrete answer for you.
I'm trying to understand a little bit if this is coming from the parent perspective or the teacher perspective. But I think, I would just go back again to communication. So I think that, if it's a policy that you want to put in place as a teacher, or actually even I would say as a parent, I think that's perfectly reasonable. My one recommendation would be to maybe give the student like a 24-hour warning that this is a new policy that is going to be in place, so they kind of have the opportunity to meet that expectation in a positive way before it becomes a punishment, so that they can, that this is going to be the policy, and then they can rise to the occasion. And so I think that's one way that you could kind of put those limits, or like John said, those kind of, that feedback to the student, but still make them feel like they are meeting expectations. It's just to give a little bit of warning.
I think that was our last question, and I know it's perfectly timed.
I have a quick, someone chatted me privately a question.
Okay.
Which I didn't know you could do, but they asked me, how is the teacher question, what ways do you think is most effective to teach students a new form of writing, specifically opinion writing, while teaching remotely? Well, one of the best ways to do it that I have found is through the whiteboard feature. Is a great, and you just type in like virtual whiteboard. There's like tons of different apps that actually let you model a whiteboard. Is a great opportunity for the modeling piece, but any type of collaborative writing app works well. So if you want to, for me to send you a bunch of different examples, please email me at mary.kelly@marist.edu, and I will send you several examples of what you can use to teach persuasive or opinion writing remotely.
And just to wrap this up, I just want to, I want to thank everybody, all of the participants for joining us, for your, for being here and for your great questions. To the panelists, John, for facilitating the question and answer. And I'll just reiterate, these are our emails, and I think we're always happy to, provide additional resources or just kind of troubleshoot questions. This is an unusual time we're all living in, and I think that, one of the things that's coming out of it is we're all going through this together and we're all learning new things. So we appreciate the conversation this evening, and, thanks for being here.